Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
When I sat down at that dinner table, I already knew exactly how the night would unfold, and still, hearing the words leave my mother's mouth hit me like a punch I had rehearsed for but never quite gotten used to taking. She looked right at me, steady and calm as if she were delivering some universal truth rather than choosing sides yet again, and said, "Your brother needs this house more. He has a wife and kids." There was no hesitation, no softening of the blow, just that cold, deliberate sentence that cut straight through years of tension we had all pretended not to see. I stared at my plate, because if I had lifted my eyes too quickly, they would have seen the fire I was holding back, and I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. You would think after a lifetime of being treated like the spare part in my own family, I would have been numb to it by now. But there's something about watching the people who are supposed to protect you announce, without a hint of shame, that your place in the family hierarchy is beneath the golden child that still burns like acid in your chest. Mark was sitting across from me, of course, smug in that way only he could pull off, half-smile curling on his lips like he had known this was coming all along. Rachel, his perfect wife, leaned against him as though the house were already theirs, and she didn't even need to speak for me to know she had been part of the whispers that led to this little announcement. My father sat at the end of the table, eyes fixed on his glass, pretending to be absent while being fully present. That's always been his role, to stay quiet, let Mom run the show, and never interfere when she tilted the balance in Mark's favor. He knew better than anyone that I wouldn't back down easily, but he wasn't about to risk Mom's wrath by speaking before I did. The silence stretched long enough that Rachel's fork clinked against her plate as she shifted, and Mom, emboldened by my lack of immediate protest, kept going. She started with the usual lines, "Mark has children to think about, the house is too big for me alone, and wasn't I always the independent one, strong enough to start over somewhere else?" It wasn't even about the house to them. It was about making sure Mark got another victory, another reminder that he came first. I wanted to laugh. Not because any of it was funny, but because of how rehearsed it all sounded, like they had gathered earlier in the week and written a script, assigning roles for each of them to play in this little performance. Rachel was supposed to look sympathetic while staying firm, Mom was supposed to sound authoritative but caring, Dad was supposed to stay out of it, and Mark was supposed to act like this was all so uncomfortable, even though he was the one pulling the strings behind the curtain. They thought I would argue, maybe shout, maybe storm out in anger, giving them the satisfaction of labeling me the emotional one yet again. But I didn't. I stayed perfectly still, kept my tone level, and let the silence hang in the room longer than anyone expected. If you have ever been underestimated for so long that people forget you're capable of anything but defeat, you'll understand the power of simply refusing to play the role they've given you. My heart was pounding, sure, but my face didn't move, and that unsettled them more than any angry outburst could have. What none of them knew, not even my father who always suspected I had something up my sleeve, was that I had been waiting for this exact moment for months. Every word Mom spoke felt like a line in a play I had memorized in advance, and I already had the ending written in ink that none of them could erase. The truth sat folded neatly in my purse, quiet and patient, like a loaded weapon I had no intention of revealing until the timing was perfect. So while Mom talked about fairness, about family, about how sometimes sacrifice is what keeps us together, I nodded slowly, because agreeing outwardly was the best way to let them walk straight into the trap they thought they had set for me. I could see Mark glance at Rachel as if to say, "See, it's working," and Rachel leaned closer to him with a small, smug grin that made me want to roll my eyes, but I didn't flinch. Let them think I was folding, let them think the guilt trip had landed, let them believe that once again I was about to walk away quietly with nothing, just as I had done so many times before. Because the longer they thought I was losing, the sweeter it would be when the ground shifted beneath their feet. The funny thing about my family is that they never bothered to consider that I might be capable of beating them at their own game. They always assumed my silence meant weakness, that my calm meant resignation, and that my distance meant defeat. But this time, silence was my weapon, and the document sitting in my bag was the blade waiting to be unsheathed. And as the conversation dragged on, with Mom practically sermonizing about how Mark deserved more, and Mark pretending to resist while obviously basking in the spotlight. I sat there almost amused, because they were so sure they had already won. They didn't realize that I had stopped playing their game a long time ago, and tonight was only about revealing the score they hadn't bothered to check. So when Mom finally paused, waiting for me to give some grand declaration of agreement or surrender, I took a sip of my water, set it down carefully, and smiled just enough to make her uneasy. Then I leaned back, letting the silence speak louder than words, and thought to myself, what they don't know is that I've been waiting for this exact night. And the paper in my purse will end this little charade in one move. If you have grown up in a family where one child is always praised as the brilliant star while the other is expected to simply make do with scraps, then you will understand how that one sentence at the dinner table was not really a surprise at all, but rather the final, predictable scene in a play that had been running for decades. A play where my brother was always cast as the lead and I was forever stuck with a thankless supporting role. From the earliest years of our lives, Mark was celebrated as the prodigy who could do no wrong, while I was scrutinized for every mistake, reminded constantly that he needed more attention because he was fragile, that he needed more money because he was building a future, that he needed more space because he had a family to raise, and somewhere in all of those conversations the assumption took root that my needs were somehow smaller, less urgent, or not worth considering at all. I still remember high school, when I wanted to attend a summer program that could have helped me get into a better college, but the tuition was considered too expensive, and my parents told me to be practical, to accept that not every opportunity was for everyone, only to watch a few weeks later as they wrote a check for Mark's sports camp without a second thought. I remember applying for scholarships and working part-time jobs just to pay for textbooks in college, while my brother was handed a brand new car at graduation with a big red bow on top, not because he needed it but because he deserved it, after all of his supposed hard work. Those memories sat heavy in my chest as I listened to my mother lecture me about sacrifice during dinner, because for me, sacrifice had never been a choice. It was the role that had been assigned to me before I even understood what fairness was supposed to look like. By the time we were adults, the pattern had become so ingrained that I could almost predict every family gathering like clockwork, Mark walking in late but still greeted like royalty, Rachel flashing her perfect smile as though she had single-handedly elevated the family's social status, my parents bending over backward to accommodate every minor inconvenience he faced, and me sitting there, nodding, watching, waiting, knowing that no matter what I achieved on my own, it would never be enough to shift their perspective. Mark bought a house? He was praised as a visionary. I bought one? I was told maybe it was too ambitious for someone like me. Mark had a child? The entire family calendar revolved around birthdays and playdates. I stayed single? I was quietly labeled as selfish, maybe even cold. And so it went, year after year, layer upon layer of small injustices that piled up until they felt like walls closing in. At that dinner table, all of those years condensed into a single evening where my mother's words confirmed once again that their loyalty was never in question, because it had always belonged to Mark. He sat there, chin lifted slightly, pretending to look uncomfortable while secretly basking in the glow of yet another victory handed to him on a silver platter. He knew, Rachel knew, Mom knew, and Dad silently knew as well, this house was supposed to be mine, yet somehow the conversation had twisted until I was the one who had to defend my right to keep what was already in front of me. It wasn't about fairness, it was about entitlement, and the worst part was that they were so confident in their belief that I would eventually fold. Rachel leaned over at one point, her voice dripping with false sympathy, and said something like, "It's not that we don't understand how important this house is to you, but you know how it is when children are involved, right?" That was the moment I realized they had not only planned this ambush, but also rehearsed the emotional manipulation, layering guilt over tradition until I was supposed to cave out of sheer exhaustion. My father kept his head down, as though the shine of his glass was suddenly more fascinating than the reality of what was unfolding, but I noticed the twitch in his jaw, the one that always gave him away whenever he knew something was wrong but lacked the courage to stand against it. What none of them realized, however, was that every smug glance Mark sent across the table, every manipulative phrase Rachel tossed in my direction, And every passive-aggressive word my mother delivered with the authority of someone who thought her decision was final only fueled the calm I had chosen to display. They thought I was cornered, but the truth was that I had spent months preparing for this moment, carefully documenting, checking, and securing every piece of paper that mattered, because if my family was going to continue to treat me like the afterthought, I was determined to make sure that at least the law did not. So as they carried on, building their case against me with words that were supposed to weaken my resolve, I sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, quietly amused, because the longer they talked, the deeper they buried themselves in the certainty that I had no defense. They didn't know about the envelope in my purse, the one I had placed there deliberately, knowing this confrontation would arrive sooner rather than later, and that when it did, I would finally have the opportunity to turn the tables in a way that none of them would see coming. And while my mother continued her monologue about duty and family legacy, and while Mark nodded along as if he were doing me a favor by graciously accepting what was rightfully his, I could almost feel the weight of that document pressing against the side of my bag, waiting, reminding me that the truth was mine to reveal whenever I chose. That knowledge gave me a sense of power they couldn't touch, and it allowed me to smile faintly when Mom paused for breath, because while they believed they had already won, I knew the game hadn't even truly started yet. They were so sure I was powerless, but I wasn't, and the paper in my purse was about to prove it. I had listened to them long enough to let the confidence swell in their voices and harden in their faces, because the longer they believed the script was unfolding in their favor, the more satisfying it would be to change the ending in a single motion. So when my mother finished another slow lecture about duty and sacrifice and Mark's precious responsibilities, I reached into my purse with the same unhurried calm I had worn all evening, slid the thick envelope onto the table like a quiet verdict, and told them, in a tone that made even my father glance up, that before we talked about who needed my house more, we should first agree on who actually owned it. I did not raise my voice or perform for effect, because I had already done the heavy lifting months earlier when I sat with a lawyer who did not drink the family Kool-Aid, walked through the chain of title line by line, and recorded a deed that moved the property into my name with the county, which meant that this was not some loose promise or sentimental arrangement, but a hard public record stamped by a clerk who did not care about my brother's feelings. And as Mark reached for the papers with that grabby entitlement he had been practicing since grade school, I told him to slow down and read the first page where the instrument number sat beneath my name, followed by the notarization and the recording date that landed squarely before any of their recent speeches about fairness. My mother skimmed past the legal language as if the fonts themselves were offensive and landed on the letter behind it, the one written by our aunt who had co-owned the place with me for a brief season after my grandmother passed. A letter in which she spelled out with suspiciously simple words that the house was deeded to me alone because I had been the person who actually kept it standing when the roof leaked and the taxes came due and everyone else was too busy to show up. A letter that did not beg for anyone's approval, but confirmed what the recorded deed already established, and I could feel the pivot in the room as that old habit of denial scraped up against something that would not move for it. Rachel tried the next tactic, the one where she clings to the idea that family agreements outrank paperwork because paper is cold and family is warm. Except I have learned the hard way that warmth from people who only touch you when they want something is not warmth at all. So I told her that paper does not have to be warm to be binding, that the county does not care about our mother's tone or Mark's schedule or anyone's sense of destiny, and that the law, in this case, had finally done what my family never could, which was to treat me the same way it would treat a stranger who followed the rules. Then, because I had not walked into that dinner to win a debate, but to end a pattern, I pulled out the second packet, the one that spelled out how things would work from this point forward, and as Mark's eyes flicked to our mother for a cue that did not come, I explained in the same calm voice that if anyone wanted to live in my home, they would do so under a formal lease administered by a property manager who did not share our last name, that the rent would be set at market rate with a security deposit equal to 2 full months of rent, that background and credit checks would be run like they are for every other applicant in this county, and that keys would not change hands because a relative demanded them, but because a signed agreement had cleared every condition. all of which was already scheduled with the manager's office for the following week and could be processed just as easily for strangers as for relatives. My mother called it cruel, and my father stared at his hands, and Mark put on the sulking hero face that has always worked for him, but none of that moved me, because what I was doing was not cruelty, it was boundaries with teeth. And when Rachel muttered something about family being above paperwork, I said that family is welcome to be above paperwork at their own address, while at mine the standards will be exactly the same for everyone, which is to say written, signed, dated, and enforceable. And then I let the silence sit there, because truly facing a boundary is like touching a live wire for people who have never been shocked before. I do not know what stung them more, the deed with its tidy stamp or the lease packet with its tidy rules, but I know the look, because I have seen it whenever the universe finally refuses them a shortcut, and since a small, clean act of revenge is best delivered in daylight with witnesses, I turned my phone so they could see the outgoing message to the extended family thread and to our lawyer, a message that included the recorded deed, the letter from our aunt, and the new leasing policy for my property, and I told them that if they still believed the house should be theirs, they were welcome to submit an application by Friday at noon, because my manager would be expecting it, and if no application arrived, the locks would be changed in the morning, and any attempt to enter without permission would be treated like it would for anyone else in this county, which is to say not as a family discussion, but as trespass, and while my mother opened and closed her mouth without sound, I reached back into my purse, tapped the screen, and said there was one more document they had not seen yet, the one that would make this conversation very short if they kept pushing. The sound that followed my hand sliding those papers across the table was not really silence so much as the thud of entitlement colliding with proof, because even though no one spoke for a long stretch, I could hear every habit in this family trying to kick back to life. My mother reaching for the same tired phrases about tradition and responsibility, my father searching for a diplomatic bridge that would let him leave the room without taking a side, Rachel assembling her polished sympathy into a shape that looked like concern but felt like pressure, and Mark doing that familiar performance where he pretends to be above the argument while quietly insisting on the outcome that benefits him. Yet none of it had anywhere to land now that the deed lay in plain view with my name on it and the county stamp telling them that this conversation had already been settled outside our kitchen. My mother tried denial first, the kind that smiles while it erases, insisting that whatever paperwork I had brought could not possibly cancel out what the family had always intended. And she leaned into that old script about how houses are for families with children and how daughters without them should be generous and sensible and willing to start over somewhere smaller. But I reminded her that generosity had been my unpaid job since grade school. And that sensibility in this case meant treating my home like a home and not a revolving door for anyone else's emergencies, and while she gathered breath for another run at me, I turned to my father and asked him whether he remembered the year I fought the county over the tax reassessment while Mark was away on vacation, because the house only survived that year because I made the calls and filed the papers and wrote the check. And he nodded with that pained, guilty look I know too well, the one that says he wishes the truth were less inconvenient. Rachel, who is very good at sounding reasonable while asking for things other people have paid for, switched tactics and pitched the line about the children again, that this was not about Mark or her, that it was about stability and family unity and little hearts that needed a yard, and I told her that I respect actual needs when they are not dressed up as guilt, and that if she truly cared about stability, she would not be trying to anchor her family's security to a house she does not own. Because stability that depends on someone else's surrender is not stability at all. It is dependency with nicer wallpaper, and while she blinked like she had not expected me to walk right through her soft focus, I opened the second packet and laid out the lease terms again, reminding them that if anyone wanted this address it would be through the same process every other tenant in this county follows, and that I had already engaged a property manager who would not be swayed by family titles or dinner table speeches. Mark finally dropped the noble act and went straight to anger, calling me ungrateful and dramatic and difficult, claiming that he had already arranged to bring over a few pieces of furniture this weekend. At which point I told him that the furniture he was referring to had been sitting in my garage under the label of temporary storage for several weeks because Rachel told me it would only be for a couple of days. And since I am done carrying the weight of their plans, I had arranged that afternoon for a moving company to pick up every box and every chair and deliver them to a storage unit rented in both of their names with the first month covered, the contract waiting at the office with their identification names printed clearly, and an access code that would be provided when they signed, which meant they could collect their belongings at their convenience without setting foot on my property, and watching his face fall as the realization hit him that I had already cut off the easiest path into my home gave me a steadiness I had been craving for years. My father muttered that maybe this had gone far enough and that perhaps we could start fresh in the morning, but I told him kindly and clearly that fresh starts are for people who stop repeating themselves, and that I was not dragging this into another day because drifting boundaries are how we got here, and then I added, because I wanted them to hear it in the same room and not through some cousin's retelling, that I had filed a simple notice with the Homeowners Association confirming that no one other than me and an approved tenant may use the shared facilities associated with this lot, and that I had also delivered a letter through my attorney to the local police department listing my home on their courtesy watch for any unauthorized attempts to enter, which is not some dramatic threat but a practical step taken by many owners in this county. And if they wished to test it, I could not stop them, though the consequences would be inconvenient and public. I do not delight in humiliation, but I will admit that there was a grim, necessary satisfaction in refusing to wear the family's old costume one more time, because for once I was not asking for fairness, I was enforcing it. And when my mother hissed that I was tearing the family apart over a building, I answered that a building cannot tear a family apart. Only people who think love requires one person to keep losing can do that, and that tonight I had decided to stop losing. And while she called me cold, I slid my phone across the table and showed her the outgoing message to the extended thread that contained the deed, the letter, the lease policy, and a short note stating that any future discussion about my home would need to go through counsel, and that I would not respond to sideways attempts to shame me into compliance, because clarity is kinder than false hope, and I was done being unclear. The room went quiet then in the truest sense, the kind of quiet that follows the first honest boundary anyone in a family has ever set, and as their eyes bounced between each other like they were searching for a new strategy that did not exist anymore, I folded the unused pages back into the envelope, the one I had mentioned earlier and had not yet opened because timing matters, and I told them in a voice that was steady enough to surprise even me that if they were truly worried about the children, I had made a plan that puts the children first in a way none of them had ever considered, and that would end this argument for good. And as my mother leaned forward with a flash of sudden hope and Mark's jaw tightened with suspicion, I said that I would explain it in the morning when everyone was calm and capable of hearing it, because the last document on this table was not a threat, it was a promise, and if they pushed me tonight I would sign it before sunrise. Morning came with the kind of cautious quiet that follows a storm everyone pretends to have slept through, and while the coffee sat untouched because none of us trusted our hands not to shake, I told them that the last envelope was not a threat designed to scare them into submission, but a plan designed to end the game that had used the children as bargaining chips, and then I opened it slowly, because I wanted every word to land at a pace that made evasion impossible, and I said that months ago. After the deed was recorded and the taxes were handled and the roof repairs were paid without any of them lifting a finger, I met with an estate attorney who had no interest in our family dramas and drafted a living trust naming my two nieces as the future beneficiaries of this home upon my death, which means that no matter how loudly anyone argues now, the house will one day belong to the girls and bypass the adults who turned every favor into a weapon, and if that sounds brutal then perhaps it is time we called things by their true names, because this is not brutality, this is protection, and for the first time the protection is aimed at the right people. I let them hear the next part without interruption, because this was the hinge on which everything would swing, and I explained that the trust includes conditions that are neither dramatic nor complicated, but are very specific. That I will remain the sole owner and occupant for as long as I choose, and that any harassment, coercion, or unauthorized entry will trigger a clause that redirects the property at my death to a community housing foundation while my nieces receive a fixed education fund. Instead, which means that if anyone decides intimidation is their best strategy, the girls lose the house and gain only what the foundation cannot claim, and if everyone decides to grow up and accept boundaries, the girls someday inherit a debt-free home that I will continue to maintain and improve until that day arrives, and I promised them that I had no interest in punishing children for the behavior of adults, which is exactly why I built the path that rewards patience and respect while closing the door on bullying and shortcuts. Mark tried to laugh it off as overcomplicated theater, but I could see the calculation grind behind his eyes, because for the first time the cost of his tantrums was not my discomfort, but his daughter's future. And when Rachel started to protest that I was using the girls to control their lives, I told her calmly that they had been using the girls to control mine for years, and that this is not control. This is a lock on a door they were never meant to pick. And while my mother sputtered about tradition and patriarchs and legacies that should remain in the hands of the eldest son, I reminded her that tradition without fairness is just entitlement dressed in old clothes, and that the county clerk had already chosen a side, which is to say the side of paperwork, and that the only choice left to the family was whether they wanted the children to win later or their pride to win now, because both outcomes could not live in the same house. Then I laid out the immediate reality in a tone so even that my father finally breathed, and I told them that the property manager would send the formal lease application by noon should anyone wish to apply, that the storage unit holding their boxes was fully paid for the first month and would require their signatures to access, that the homeowners association had been notified about authorized users, and that the courtesy watch at the police department would remain in place until I chose otherwise, which meant that there would be no midnight visits, no spare key rescues, and no soft landings arranged by guilt, and that if we were going to have a relationship it would be built on invitations rather than invasions, on plans rather than ambushes, and on yes and no that actually mean yes and no. My father cleared his throat and asked, in the smallest voice I have ever heard from a man who has spent his whole life trying not to make waves, whether the trust meant he would never again eat dinner in this kitchen. And I told him that he would always be welcome when he came as himself rather than as a messenger for someone else's demands, and I watched his shoulders drop in a way that told me he had been carrying the weight of two loyalties for too long, while my mother called me cold and ungrateful and a stranger to my own blood, and I answered that I had been a stranger in this house since childhood, and that I was simply refusing to be one in my own home, and that she could stay angry or stay honest, but she could not stay in charge. What happened next was not dramatic, because real endings rarely are, and yet it was the clearest victory I have ever felt, since Mark stood up with that restless jerk he uses when the performance has failed and said he would not beg for walls and floors, that he had a family to prioritize and would figure something out, and I told him that figuring something out is what adults do when the free options end, and that if he ever wanted his daughters to walk into this house someday and call it theirs, he would stop pointing at my front door and start building his own, and he looked at me for a long, complicated moment that held more truth than anything he had said all night before he nodded once, slow and small, and left with Rachel close behind, her glare sharp but unsettled in a way that made me think she had heard the only part of the plan that mattered. After they were gone, I sealed the envelope, placed it back in my purse, and told my parents that the papers would be signed and filed this week regardless of anyone's mood, because the plan was never a bluff, but a boundary with a future attached. And I walked them to the door without drama or apology, because I had given them a choice and a map and a reason to take it, and as the lock clicked, I felt the quiet that follows a final move, not triumphant noise, but the steadiness that comes when you stop defending your place and simply live in it, and if anyone wants to call that ruthless they can, though I will call it what it is, which is winning without breaking what matters, and building a bridge that stands only if everyone leaves their crowns at the waterline. And whether they cross it is on them, while the house, the deed, and the future are finally, firmly, undeniably on me.